Religion is something that human beings created. They used religion to explain natural phenomenon people didn't yet understand scientifically. For instance, the Bible talks about Jesus casting demons out of people. Obviously, something humans made up before they understood epilepsy. And religion has been used to reinforce different social orders. It provides legitimacy to the ruling classes. It provides consolation to the slaves and the oppressed. And it says to everyone that the reasons for suffering and oppression in human society lie deep within humanity's fundamental nature and can neither be understood nor in any fundamental way changed. The history of the spread of religion is the history of wars, of one people conquering another, of torture, of suppression of inquiry in science, of the forcible subjugation of women, that is, half of humanity. At the heart of all this is a very definite and a very negative view of human nature, which I'll get into. But first, a bit on the concept of a fixed, unchanging human nature overall. Different societies have been organized to produce and reproduce the basic requirements of life in different ways. And this has given rise to different social relations and different notions of right and wrong, of how society ought to be, and as part of this, how people understand human nature. As Marx said, and Avakian has further developed in A Way with All Gods, all history is nothing but the continuous transformation of human nature. That is to say, each historical epoch had very definite and very different conceptions of what it meant to be human. Today, it seems natural for people to talk about marketing themselves, not just when they're looking for a job, but even when they're looking for a date. Everybody's heard this. So-and-so and I broke up, so I'm back on the market. But these ideas aren't natural. They are shaped by the underlying dynamics of our society, organized as it is in capitalist production, where everything, even people, are turned into commodities, and people are hurled into competition with each other. Or what about the notion of racial superiority that went along with slavery? The idea that black people are suited for back-breaking labor and less than human, so it's okay to sell their children out of the parents' arms like mere chattel. Today, everyone can say that slavery is unnatural and barbaric, but not that long ago, it was enshrined in the founding documents of this country. When slavery was a dominant mode of production, the ruling ideas deemed this to be part of human nature. Or what to make of the fact that the majority of our time on this planet as a species, we lived in relatively non-oppressive, egalitarian, gather-hunter societies. Within these societies, there were no strict social hierarchies or relations of exploitation and oppression. If you told these people in these societies that it was human nature for one group to rule over another, they'd look at you in puzzlement. All this tells us something about human nature, that above all, people's nature and behavior is incredibly plastic and changeable, and that notions of human nature are conditioned by the social relations and ultimately the production relations of the society in which they live. In short, human nature is neither innately good nor innately bad. It is most of all adaptive and responsive. With that as a background, I want to look more closely at the view of human nature that's reflected and reinforced in the Bible. The authors of the Bible lived in societies constantly at war over lands and customs. These societies practiced slavery. They stoned disobedient children. They systematically raped women as part of their wars. They burned down whole villages of people for worshiping the wrong God. They butchered people for worshiping the right God, but doing so in the wrong way. All this is not just one book of the Bible or two books of the Bible that happen to somehow get included. All these things are at the foundation and the heart of the Bible, from the Mosaic books to the Gospels of the New Testament to the person of Jesus Christ himself. And let's get right down on the ground. The authors of the Bible not only constructed a cult around virginity, they demanded that women be stoned to death if it could not be proven that they were virgins when they were given as property from their fathers to their husbands. How anyone can justify looking to any part of this book in any age, but especially this one, is shocking. Listen to what's said in Deuteronomy. If any man take a wife and go unto her and hate her, and say, I took this woman, but when I came to her, I found her not a virgin. If this be true, and the tokens of virginity be not found for the damsel, then they shall bring out the damsel to the door of her father's house, and then the men of her city shall stone her with stones that she die. On a very basic level, if it was just human nature for women to be subordinate to men, If this was something we were just hardwired for, then no one would have to have written it down, commandments about killing women if they weren't virgins when they got married. No one would have had to enshrine this as public ritual to be carried out by all the men in the village and backed up by the weight of otherworldly righteousness and authority. If this was in our nature, no one would have had to write it down in their so-called holy scriptures. And you can say, oh, no one believes all the most extreme stuff today, but that's bullshit. Not only are women being stoned all over the world in so-called honor killings, but right here in this country, every single day, 4 women are killed by their boyfriends or their husbands. And what is the white wedding dress and all this abstinence only that's making such a vicious comeback right now, except a continuation of the same values and traditions, including the father giving the daughter away as property and virginal property at that? And what are all these attacks, legally and violently, on abortion clinics and abortion rights, on birth control and divorce, all these things which already have a huge impact on women's lives and which have fascist contours not far down the road? What are these except a forceful reassertion of biblical notions that women can only redeem themselves for their original sin through childbearing and submission to men? And what about the cult of motherhood, where even women who fight their way into the professional world are weighed down with guilt because they're not at home baking cookies for their children? Or what about the poor women, disrespected at every turn, often abused with no real future, made to believe that the only way they can find respect, to really be loved, is by having a baby? All this is being reinforced and sanctified by religious institutions today, from the Pope to Islam to popular preachers like T.D. Jakes. And I can't move on without calling out Jesus on this too. Because all the time people want to come forward and say, oh no, Jesus, he was better towards women. Remember how he was forgiving and prevented people from killing that adulteress? You know the one where Jesus supposedly said, let he amongst you without sin cast the first stone? There's only 2 problems with this. First, as Bart Ehrman documents, this story never happened. It was written into the Bible many years after Jesus' death. It is utter fabrication. And second, even if it were true, think about what's actually being said. Jesus doesn't challenge the assumptions that this adulteress is a sinner who deserves to be stoned. And he specifically does not reject the Mosaic law commanding this when he's challenged on it. He just objects to others thinking they have the right to judge because they too are sinners. Come on now. None of this is natural. Human societies have not always been this way. As I pointed to earlier, for eons, our species lived in primitive communal societies. Not that these societies were idyllic, but people were not divided into classes. However, as Avakian, drawing on Engels, explains in A Way with All Gods, once human societies, thousands of years ago, evolved and changed in such a way that the wealth produced by society was taken, for the most part, by a small group of people who dominated and exploited the rest. Once private property and wealth of individuals emerged and developed, then not only was the basic role of women increasingly reduced to being a breeder of children, but it also became crucial to ensure that her children would be those of her husband, so that he could pass on his property to his heirs, and in particular his male heirs, and not somebody else's. So then women's sexual activity had to be carefully controlled, end quote. These notions of women as property of men and breeders of children, notions codified and enforced by judgment, custom, and brutality in all the major religions, are rooted in the past. They can be overcome, but only by digging up the soil from which they arise, only by digging down to the foundations of society, only by overcoming the division of society into classes whose lines of inheritance need to be reproduced, and only by taking up the emancipation of women as a key component of that revolutionary transformation. Only in this way can these relations be overcome, done away with, and buried in history where they belong. But this cannot happen without going up against the Bible and up against religion in all of its forms.